Angry protesters accompany the coffin of a student who was shot dead on Wednesday during violent protests against the removal of fuel subsidies. Opposition parties estimate that as many as 60 people were killed in the protests. These demonstrators shout they want to overthrow the government. This man shows bullets he says were fired by security forces. Elsewhere in Khartoum, the streets appeared calm as people stayed away from work and schools remained closed. Long queues were forming at petrol stations across Khartoum on Thursday. Fear of shortages came a day after many petrol stations had been torched during violent protests. Internet services have been restored after a 24-hour internet blackout that had prevented protesters organising themselves through social media. Cars were burned and buildings torched in the demonstrations, which were markedly more violent than similar protests here last year. The government did not condemn the protests themselves, but did condemn the level of violence involved.
We don't fear or feel embarrassed by these protests. It is understandable and respected, but we condemn all protests that damage public properties or individuals and their rights.
The government says it can no longer afford to offer cheap fuel. Sudan is desperately short of cash after its economy lost some 70% of its oil income when South Sudan became independent 2 years ago. But some say lifting fuel subsidies will lead to higher bus fares and food prices, which people here feel they can no longer afford. They say they've been struggling with rising prices for months now because of the high inflation rate, which according to some analysts remains as high as 50%. The leader of the opposition Umma party is now calling for peaceful protests and a general strike.
The salvation of the nation lies in a new system. Our party has laid out our vision for this new system, a vision for a new constitution, a comprehensive and just peace, and how to achieve this: mobilization, sit-ins, and civil protests leading to a general strike.
The government was clearly prepared for these demonstrations, and there's currently a high security presence on the streets of Khartoum. In contrast, Sudan's opposition parties have a reputation for being disorganized and poorly led. So while more demonstrations are expected in the coming days, it's not clear where they're headed. Harriet Martin, Al Jazeera, Khartoum.